After more than 40 years on this bench, I've learned that strength doesn't always look like standing tall. Sometimes strength looks like showing up when your body is failing you. Sometimes it looks like taking one slow step at a time, leaning on the podium just to stay upright, and refusing to let life take away your dignity. That was the lesson I was reminded of one morning when a person walked into my courtroom so weak and tired that the entire room seemed to quiet on its own. That morning started like most mornings do for me. I woke up early, before the house stirred, and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of strong black coffee. I've had it the same way for decades. No sugar, no cream, just quiet. Those early minutes give me time to prepare myself for the people I'm about to meet, even when I don't yet know who they are. By 8:15, I was walking into the courthouse, nodding to familiar faces, feeling the rhythm of the building come alive. Footsteps echoed in the hallways, papers shuffled, doors opened and closed. The courthouse has a way of waking up slowly, just like the people inside it. In my chambers, Christina had already laid out the files. She knows my routine better than anyone, neatly stacked, notes ready, coffee waiting. After all these years, we worked together, almost without speaking. I glanced through the docket. Traffic matters, missed appearances, minor violations, nothing that stood out on paper, and that's something I've learned never to trust. Paper doesn't show pain, paper doesn't show exhaustion, paper doesn't show what it took for someone just to get there. When I took my seat on the bench and looked out over my courtroom, I did what I always do. I looked at people, not charges. Faces tell stories before words ever do. The morning moved along steadily, case after case, some people defensive, some apologetic, some distracted. I listened. I asked questions. I ruled. Then Christina called the next name, and the moment I looked up, I felt the room change. I watched as a person stood up slowly from the bench, not hesitant, careful, deliberate, like every movement required thought. Someone beside them stood up too, ready to help, but stopped when the person nodded, insisting on doing it themselves. I noticed the way their body leaned slightly forward, as if balance was something that couldn't be taken for granted anymore. I noticed how thin their arms looked inside their jacket. I noticed how tired their face was, not from a long night, but from something deeper. As they walked toward the podium, the room grew quieter, not out of instruction, out of instinct. When they reached the podium, they rested their hands on it, not casually, but for support. I could see the effort it took just to remain standing. Their breathing was shallow, controlled, measured. I asked them to state their name. Their voice was soft, weaker than expected, but clear, determined. That told me something immediately. This was not someone giving up. This was someone pushing through. I explained why they were there. A minor matter, nothing serious on paper. But as I spoke, I watched their eyes, focused, present. They were listening carefully, even though I could tell it took energy to do so. I asked if they understood the charge. They nodded slowly. I asked if they wanted to explain what happened. They took a breath before speaking, a longer breath than usual, and then they said something that stopped me cold. They said they were living with ALS. That word landed heavily in the room. I've been on this bench long enough to recognize when a courtroom shifts emotionally. This was one of those moments. ALS is not something you mention casually. It's not something you use as an excuse. It's something that changes everything. They told me they were getting weaker every month, that tasks that used to be simple now took planning and rest, that driving, walking, even speaking required effort. Standing there, they said, was exhausting. I listened without interrupting. I didn't look at the clock. I didn't rush. Some explanations deserve space. They explained that the violation happened on a day when their body simply wouldn't cooperate. A delay, a missed detail, something they would have caught easily before the illness. Not negligence, limitation. As they spoke, I watched their hands. They trembled slightly, not from nerves, from fatigue. I watched their jaw tighten as they tried to keep their voice steady. Pride does that. Pride doesn't disappear when the body weakens. I felt something tighten in my chest. I've seen people come into my courtroom angry. I've seen arrogance. I've seen entitlement. What stood before me that morning was none of those things. It was vulnerability paired with dignity, and that combination commands respect. I asked them gently how they were doing today, not legally, personally. They gave a small, tired smile and said, "I'm here." That answer told me everything. I removed my glasses and set them on the bench. I do that when I want someone to know I'm speaking to them as a person, not just as a judge. I leaned forward slightly and told them to take a moment if they needed it. They nodded again, grateful but determined not to sit unless absolutely necessary. I thought about my own parents. I thought about how illness changes roles, how independence slips away piece by piece, and how hard it is for someone to stand in a place of authority when their body is betraying them. I asked them one more question. I asked them what coming to court had cost them that day. They paused. Then they said it took everything they had. That answer stayed with me. I hadn't ruled yet. I hadn't even addressed the law, but I already knew something important. This case was not about a violation. It was about dignity, effort, and the courage it takes to show up when your strength is fading. And that's where this story truly began. As they stood there holding onto the podium, I could see how much effort it was taking just to remain upright. This wasn't nervousness. This was exhaustion layered over determination. I've learned over the years to recognize the difference, and once you see it, you can't ignore it. I told them to please sit down if they needed to. I said it gently, without command. For a moment they hesitated. Pride does that. Then they nodded and carefully lowered themselves into the chair beside the podium. Even sitting took effort. Even sitting required focus. The room stayed silent. No one shifted. No one whispered. Everyone felt the weight of the moment. I asked them to continue when they were ready. I slowed my voice, knowing energy was precious. They thanked me quietly and explained a little more about their situation. They said ALS had changed their life in ways they never imagined. Simple tasks had become calculated decisions. How far to walk, how long to stand, whether today was a good day or not. They told me that coming to court had taken planning, rest the night before, extra time in the morning, assistance they weren't used to accepting yet. They said they almost didn't come, not because they didn't care, but because their body was unpredictable. That mattered to me. I asked them if they had ever been in trouble before. They shook their heads slowly. I asked if they understood why the rule existed. They nodded again. Every response was deliberate, nothing careless, nothing dismissive. I looked down at the file. The violation was minor, a technical issue, something that would barely register for a healthy person on a normal day. But life wasn't normal for them anymore. And justice has to live in reality, not theory. I asked them how long they had been diagnosed. They took a breath before answering and said it had been just over a year, long enough to know what was coming, long enough to feel the losses begin. They didn't dramatize it. They didn't ask for sympathy. They simply stated facts. That restraint told me more than words ever could. I thought about how many people equate weakness with failure, how illness can make someone feel like they're constantly falling short of expectations they once met easily. Standing in a courtroom under those conditions takes courage most people never have to summon. I leaned forward slightly and spoke calmly. I told them that showing up that day was not a small thing. I told them that effort matters, that intention matters, and that the law is not blind to human limits when it's applied with wisdom. I could see their eyes soften, not with relief yet, with recognition. I told them that courts exist to maintain order, not to strip dignity from people who are already carrying heavy burdens. I told them that justice isn't measured by how harshly rules are enforced, but by how thoughtfully they are applied. I asked them if they had support, someone helping them manage day-to-day life. They nodded and said they did, family, friends, people adjusting alongside them, but they admitted that asking for help was still hard. That admission mattered too. I told them something I've learned watching people face illness. Independence doesn't disappear all at once. It fades in stages, and letting others help is not giving up. It's adapting. They listened closely. I could tell they were holding on to every word, not because of the ruling, but because being spoken to like this mattered. At that point, I noticed their hands trembling more noticeably. Fatigue was catching up. I didn't want to push them further than necessary. I had already seen what I needed to see. I told them I was ready to rule. Before I did, I wanted them to hear something clearly. I told them that I respected the effort it took for them to be there. I told them that the court recognizes intent, not just outcomes. And I told them that their illness did not make them irresponsible or careless. Their shoulders dropped slightly. That release was visible. I dismissed the charge. For a moment, they didn't react, not because they didn't understand, but because processing takes energy when you're already depleted. Then their eyes filled, not dramatically, quietly. They nodded and whispered thank you, but their voice caught. I stopped them gently. I told them they didn't owe the court thanks. I told them they owed themselves recognition for continuing to show up in a life that was asking more of them every day. I told them to take care of themselves, to pace themselves, and to remember that the law is meant to support people, not exhaust them further. As they stood slowly, someone beside them moved to help again. This time they accepted it without hesitation. That acceptance felt like growth, not defeat. They left the podium moving carefully, but with something else too: relief, validation, dignity intact. As Christina called the next case, I sat back and took a breath. Moments like that don't happen often, but when they do, they stay with you. This wasn't about mercy for the sake of mercy. This was about justice that understands limits. And as the day went on, I couldn't stop thinking about how many people fight invisible battles while still trying to meet the world's expectations. I knew the story wasn't finished yet, because compassion, when it's genuine, doesn't end at the ruling. After they left the podium, I noticed how the courtroom remained quiet for a few seconds longer than usual. No one rushed to move. No one whispered. It was as if everyone needed a moment to absorb what they had just witnessed. I've seen many reactions in my courtroom over the years, but that shared stillness told me something important. People recognized courage when they saw it. Christina called the next case and court continued, but my attention lingered. I glanced toward the door where they had exited, thinking about how much effort it had taken for them just to walk in, speak, and remain standing as long as they did. That wasn't weakness, that was strength operating under limits. As I listened to the next few cases, I found myself more aware of my tone, my pace, my posture. Illness teaches you something about time. It slows everything down, whether you want it to or not. And sometimes slowing down is exactly what justice needs. During a brief break, Christina leaned over and said softly that the person with ALS had asked if they could sit for a few minutes in the hallway before leaving the building. She said they were resting before continuing their day. I nodded immediately. There was no rush. There never should be in moments like that. I thought about how often people equate productivity with worth, how illness challenges that idea in the most unforgiving way. You can be doing everything right and still fall behind. Standing before a judge in that condition requires humility most of us never have to practice. When court resumed, I noticed the gallery felt different. People were listening more closely. They were quieter. Sometimes one moment of truth resets an entire room. Later that morning, another person stood before me with a minor violation. They came in defensive, arms crossed, ready to argue. Instead of matching that energy, I spoke calmly. I asked questions. I listened. Slowly, their posture changed. I thought about how compassion doesn't weaken authority, it stabilizes it. I realized that what people witnessed earlier wasn't mercy alone, it was recognition. Recognition of effort, recognition of reality, recognition that rules exist for living people, not theoretical ones. During lunch, I sat alone in my chambers with a simple sandwich. I didn't turn on the television. I rarely do on days like that. I replayed the morning in my mind, the careful steps, the controlled breathing, the quiet dignity. It stayed with me. I thought about my own parents again. I thought about how illness changes family dynamics, how it forces roles to shift, how pride and dependence clash. Watching someone face that and still show up to court reminded me of how fragile independence really is. That afternoon, as court resumed, I found myself asking more questions than usual, not to challenge people, but to understand them. I asked about circumstances, about obstacles, about intent. The answers mattered. At one point, I noticed someone in the gallery sitting with a folded program, eyes fixed on the bench. They weren't scheduled for any case. They were simply watching. I realized it was the same person with ALS. They had returned to observe for a short while before leaving. That surprised me. Despite exhaustion, they wanted to see how the system worked. They wanted to understand the process they had just been part of. That curiosity, even in the face of illness, spoke volumes. After court adjourned for the day, I remained seated as people filed out. When the room was nearly empty, they approached the bench slowly again, this time with support. They apologized for coming back up. I told them there was no need. They said they just wanted to say thank you properly. They said they had been afraid that coming to court would make them feel smaller, weaker, less capable. Instead, they said they felt seen. That word matters. They told me that being spoken to with patience had given them confidence they didn't realize they had lost. They said that sometimes illness takes more than strength. It takes identity, and that moment had helped them hold on to theirs. I listened quietly. I didn't rush them. I didn't interrupt. Some things need to be heard fully. I told them something honestly. I told them that dignity doesn't disappear because a body changes. I told them that showing up, even when it costs everything you have, is one of the strongest things a person can do. They nodded slowly, eyes moist but steady. Before they left, I told them to pace themselves. I told them that conserving energy is not quitting. It's choosing to keep going. They smiled faintly at that. As they turned to leave, I watched carefully. They moved slowly, but deliberately. Supported, but not defeated. That image stayed with me. On my drive home that evening, I turned off the radio and let the quiet fill the car. I thought about how rarely we slow down enough to truly see each other. How systems can unintentionally punish those who are already struggling just to participate. At home, my wife noticed I was quieter than usual. She asked what was on my mind. I told her about the person with ALS. I told her about their effort, their pride, their determination. She listened carefully, then said something simple. She said, "Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who ask the least of the world." That stayed with me. As the weeks went on, I thought often about that morning, not with sadness, but with respect. Respect for someone who refused to let illness erase their responsibility or their dignity. I realized something important. Compassion isn't about lowering standards. It's about recognizing when someone is already giving everything they have, and I knew then that this story wasn't finished. Because sometimes the real impact of compassion shows up later, in ways you don't expect. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about that person more often than I expected. Not in a way that distracted me from my work, but in a way that sharpened it. When someone shows you that kind of quiet courage, it changes how you look at everyone else who stands before you. A few mornings later, as I reviewed the docket in my chambers, Christina mentioned something in passing. She said the person with ALS had called the clerk's office. not to complain, not to question the ruling, just to ask if everything had been properly recorded so there would be no confusion later. That small detail mattered to me. It told me that even while living with a progressive illness, they were still thinking ahead, still trying to take care of responsibilities, still unwilling to let anything slip if they could help it. Illness had changed their body, but not their character. I asked Christina to let them know everything was in order and that there was nothing more they needed to worry about. When she nodded and left my chambers, I sat back in my chair and thought about how many people, healthy or not, would have walked away and forgotten about it entirely. That same morning in court, another case came before me that echoed the same theme in a different way. A middle-aged man stood before me, frustrated and defensive. His case was minor, but his tone was sharp. Instead of responding in kind, I slowed my voice and asked him to explain what was really bothering him. He hesitated, then admitted he was overwhelmed. Work stress, family illness, financial pressure. His anger softened as he spoke. I thought about how often anger is just fear wearing a louder mask. I realized then that the person with ALS hadn't just affected me. They had reset my awareness. They had reminded me that everyone who walks into court is carrying something even if it doesn't show. Later that week I saw them again, not in court, in the hallway. I was walking back to my chambers when I noticed them sitting on a bench near the elevators, resting. Someone sat beside them, speaking quietly. When they noticed me, they smiled faintly and nodded. That small gesture carried more strength than most people realize. I stopped briefly and asked how they were doing. I didn't ask as a judge. I asked as a person. They said they were tired, but grateful. They said coming to court had taken more out of them than they expected, but they were glad they came. They told me something that stayed with me. They said that standing there, even weak and exhausted, made them feel like they were still part of the world, like they hadn't been pushed aside yet. When they said that, I felt a weight settle in my chest. Illness isolates people in ways that are hard to explain. When systems move too fast, they leave people behind without meaning to. That brief conversation reminded me how important it is to slow down. I told them they were always welcome to sit, to rest, to take whatever time they needed. I told them that the courthouse exists for people, not the other way around. They thanked me quietly, then closed their eyes for a moment, conserving energy. As I walked away, I thought about dignity again. Dignity isn't about independence. It's about being treated as if you still matter when independence starts slipping. That evening at home, I told my wife about seeing them in the hallway. I told her how weak they looked compared to the first day, and how strong they still felt somehow. She listened carefully and said something that struck me deeply. She said, "Illness doesn't take away who you are. It just forces the world to decide whether it will still see you." She was right. The following week, court was busy. The docket was full. But even in the rush, I found myself pausing more often, letting people sit when they needed to, slowing explanations, watching faces more closely. Compassion had become part of the rhythm, not an exception. One afternoon, a young woman approached the podium with her elderly father. He was unsteady on his feet, clearly struggling. Without thinking, I told him to sit. I adjusted my pace. I spoke gently. I saw relief spread across his face. That image brought me right back to the person with ALS. I realized something important. Compassion isn't just about big decisions. It's about dozens of small ones. A chair, a pause, a softer voice. Those things add up. A few days later, Christina handed me a note during a break. She said someone had left it at the clerk's window, addressed simply to the court. When I opened it, I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from them. They wrote that they didn't know how much time they had left where standing, driving, and speaking would still be possible. But they wrote that being treated with patience had made one difficult day easier to carry. They said they wanted me to know that. I read the note slowly, twice. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my desk drawer where I keep reminders. Not reminders of authority, but reminders of responsibility. As the weeks passed, I heard small updates through the courthouse. Their health continued to decline. They were relying more on help, moving more slowly, choosing carefully where to spend their energy. And yet they remained engaged. They remained present. They remained themselves. I thought often about how the law can feel unforgiving when applied without context, how rules can become burdens when people's bodies can no longer keep up with them. That thought stayed with me every time someone frail or exhausted stood before me. I realized that justice doesn't always look like enforcing compliance. Sometimes it looks like acknowledging reality. That person had not asked for special treatment. They had asked for understanding, and understanding, when given honestly, creates trust instead of resentment. As I continued my work, I carried that lesson with me. Every tired face, every shaky hand, every pause in speech, they all told stories worth hearing. And I knew the story of the person with ALS still wasn't finished, because compassion doesn't end at the bench. As the months went on, I stopped seeing their name on any docket, and that was a good thing. Court is not a place people should have to return to often, especially when every outing costs them more energy than it used to. But even without seeing them, their presence stayed with me. One morning, Christina mentioned that someone had asked about courtroom accessibility. Not a complaint, not a demand, just a question. When she told me who it was, I felt that familiar pause again. It was them. They were thinking ahead, not just for themselves, but for others who might come after them. They wanted to know if seating could be adjusted, if people with limited strength could sit sooner, if the process could be made less physically demanding. That told me something important. Even as their world was shrinking, they were still thinking outward. I told Christina to assure them we would make accommodations whenever possible, and to let them know they never needed to push themselves for the sake of formality. The law does not require suffering. It requires fairness. That afternoon, I found myself noticing details I had overlooked before. How long people stood waiting, how high the podium felt for someone leaning forward, how exhausting it must be to sit upright for hours when your body is already fighting you. Once you see those things, you can't unsee them. Later that week, I saw them again unexpectedly. I was leaving the building when I noticed them sitting in a car near the entrance, door open, resting before driving away. Someone else was with them, helping quietly. When they saw me, they raised a hand slowly in greeting. I walked over and asked how they were feeling that day. They smiled faintly and said it was a hard day, but not the hardest. That answer carried both honesty and resilience. They told me they were learning how to measure their days differently now, not by what they got done, but by what they were able to experience. Coming to court, they said, had been one of those experiences, difficult but meaningful. They said something else that stayed with me. They said being treated with patience had reminded them that they still belonged in places like that they hadn't been pushed to the margins yet. I told them something honestly. I told them that belonging isn't something illness can take away. It's something society either protects or ignores, and that we all have a responsibility in that choice. They nodded slowly, eyes tired but attentive. As they prepared to leave, I told them to be careful driving and to take their time. They smiled again, that same faint smile, and thanked me. Then they rested their head back against the seat, conserving energy. I stood there for a moment after they drove away, thinking about how many people face progressive illness with dignity the world never acknowledges. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just keeps going quietly. Back in court the following week, I noticed how differently I approached people who were struggling physically. I offered seats sooner. I shortened explanations when possible. I adjusted pacing without being asked. Those changes didn't weaken the court. They strengthened it. One day, an elderly woman stood before me, visibly exhausted. Before she could even speak, I invited her to sit. The relief on her face was immediate. She smiled, not out of joy, but out of gratitude. That smile reminded me of them. I realized something important. Compassion isn't about bending the law. It's about bending ourselves enough to meet people where they are. During a quiet afternoon, Christina brought me another note. This one was shorter. It was from them again. They wrote that their mobility had decreased significantly, that outings were becoming rare, but they wanted me to know that the court experience had stayed with them. They wrote that being treated with dignity on a hard day had become a reference point, something they returned to when days felt especially heavy. They wrote that it reminded them they were still respected. I sat with that note for a long time. People underestimate how powerful it is to be treated normally when your body is changing, to not be rushed, to not be pitied, to not be ignored. That balance is difficult, but it matters. That evening at home, my wife and I talked again about illness, aging, and dignity. She said something that echoed in my mind long after. She said that people don't fear death as much as they fear being forgotten while they're still alive. That's what this was really about. As my work continued, I carried that awareness with me. I noticed how often systems assume strength, how rarely they plan for fragility, and how simple adjustments can make a world of difference. The person with ALS had come into my courtroom weak and tired, but they left something behind that was strong and lasting, a reminder, a lesson. They reminded me that justice should never demand more than someone can physically give. They reminded me that dignity should not depend on health, and they reminded me that compassion, when it's sincere, does more than resolve a case. It affirms a life. I knew then that this story was nearing its end, not because their journey was over, but because the lesson had settled, and I was ready to carry it forward. As more time passed, I noticed that I had begun to carry that lesson into every corner of my work. Not consciously at first, it just became part of how I moved, how I spoke, how I listened. The person with ALS had not changed the law. They had changed my awareness of it. One morning as I walked into the courthouse, I noticed how many people moved more slowly than the system expected them to. An older man gripping the handrail, a woman catching her breath after climbing a short set of stairs, a young person leaning heavily on a cane. These weren't exceptions, they were reminders. In my chambers, Christina commented that I had been asking people to sit more often. I smiled and told her that standing is overrated. She smiled back. After years of working together, she knew exactly what I meant. That same day, a man stood before me who reminded me again of the person with ALS. He wasn't ill in the same way, but he was worn down. His voice was hoarse. His posture sagged. He spoke like someone who had been carrying too much for too long. I slowed the pace. I asked questions gently. I listened. And when the case was resolved, I saw relief spread across his face. Not because of the ruling, but because he had been heard. I realized then that compassion is not something you switch on only for extreme circumstances. It's something you practice consistently because you never really know what someone is carrying. Later that week, Christina brought me a message that made me pause. She said the person with ALS had been admitted to a care facility. Mobility was now extremely limited. They were no longer driving. Outings were rare. Energy was carefully rationed. Hearing that, I sat quietly for a long moment. There was no sadness in the pause, just respect. Respect for the reality of what they were facing. Respect for how they had faced it so far. A few days later, another letter arrived. This one was shorter than the others, written with more effort. The handwriting was shakier, the lines less steady. I recognized it immediately. They wrote that speaking was becoming more difficult, so writing was their way of staying connected. They wrote that they didn't know how much longer they would be able to do even that, but they wanted me to know something before it became too hard. They wrote that the day they came to court had stayed with them. that being treated with patience and dignity on a day when they felt weak had helped them accept help later on without shame. They wrote that it had changed how they viewed themselves. I read that letter slowly, aware of every word. They said something else that stayed with me deeply. They wrote that the hardest part of illness wasn't the physical decline, it was the feeling that you become invisible, that you stop being seen as a full person. That day in court, they said, reminded them they were still whole. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my drawer. I didn't speak for a while. That evening at home, I told my wife about the letter. I told her about the shakier handwriting, the careful words, the honesty. She listened quietly and then reached for my hand. She didn't say anything right away. When she did speak, she said something simple and true. She said that dignity is not something we give people. It's something we protect for them when they can't protect it themselves. That stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, I noticed myself paying even closer attention to small signs of fatigue, a pause before answering, a hand gripping the edge of the podium, a breath taken just a bit too carefully. Those signs told stories louder than words. I found myself adjusting without being asked, offering water, inviting people to sit, shortening explanations when possible. None of those things weakened the authority of the court. They strengthened its humanity. One afternoon, as court was ending, I sat alone for a moment and thought about the balance between justice and compassion. They are not opposites. They are partners. When one is missing, the other suffers. I realized that the person with ALS had not asked for mercy. They had asked for understanding, and understanding, when given honestly, creates trust rather than resentment. As my days on the bench continued, I carried that truth with me. Every tired face, every unsteady step, every hesitant voice, they all deserve the same thing, to be seen. I knew then that the final chapter of this story was close, not because the struggle was over, but because the lesson had settled into something permanent. The final chapter of this story didn't arrive in my courtroom. It didn't come with a gavel or a ruling. It came softly, the way most truths do when they're meant to stay with you for the rest of your life. It came on an ordinary afternoon. Court had ended for the day, and I was sitting alone in my chambers, the building slowly emptying around me. The noise faded, the hallways quieted. I removed my robe and folded it carefully, the same way I've done thousands of times. But that day, my hands moved more slowly. Christina knocked gently and stepped inside. She didn't speak right away. She handed me an envelope and said it had arrived earlier, marked personal. I recognized the handwriting immediately, even before I opened it. It was from them. The writing was noticeably shakier than before. The lines weren't straight. The words leaned, like they needed support. I could tell it had taken effort. I sat down before reading it, because some things deserve your full attention. They wrote that their strength had declined significantly. Standing was now rare. Speaking was difficult. Most days were spent resting, conserving what little energy remained. But they wrote that they wanted to write one last time while they still could. They wrote that the day they came to court was one of the hardest days they had physically endured that year. But it was also one of the most meaningful. They wrote that they had feared being treated like a problem to manage instead of a person to respect. Instead, they wrote, they felt dignity. That word appeared again. They said that being treated with patience had stayed with them during the long days that followed, that when their body felt like it was disappearing piece by piece, that memory reminded them they were still seen as whole, still worthy of time, still worthy of respect. They wrote something else that stopped me completely. They wrote that compassion doesn't cure illness, but it can ease suffering in ways medicine cannot, that it changes how a person carries what they cannot change. I sat with that letter for a long time after I finished reading it. I didn't move. I didn't speak. After 40 years on this bench, Moments like that still humble me. I thought back to the first moment I saw them stand up from the bench carefully, deliberately, refusing to let weakness erase their dignity. I thought about how close they came to feeling invisible, and how small the decision was that changed that. I realized something important then. Justice isn't always about what happens in the courtroom. Sometimes it's about what follows someone home afterward, what they carry with them when the doors close, what stays with them on the hardest days. That day in court didn't change their diagnosis. It didn't change the progression of their illness. But it changed how they experienced one moment of it, and that mattered. I placed the letter gently in my drawer alongside others I keep private. They're not reminders of authority. They're reminders of responsibility, of the weight words can carry when someone is already carrying everything else. As the weeks passed, I heard through quiet channels that their condition continued to decline. Outings became rare, communication became difficult. Eventually updates stopped coming altogether. I don't know exactly when they passed, and in a way, I don't need to. I know enough. I know that on one difficult day, when their body was weak and tired, they came to court and were treated with compassion instead of indifference. I know they left with their dignity intact, and I know that mattered to them. Every time someone frail or exhausted stands before me now, I think of them. Every unsteady step, every pause in speech, every hand gripping the podium for balance. I see it all differently. I've learned that strength is not about how much you can endure silently. It's about being allowed to be human when endurance is already costing you everything. After more than 40 years on this bench, I still believe something deeply. The law should never demand more than a person can physically give. It should meet people where they are, not where it's convenient for the system. Authority without compassion becomes cruelty. Compassion without responsibility becomes chaos. Justice lives in the balance between the two. That person with ALS taught me that balance in a way no book ever could. They reminded me that dignity does not fade with health, that respect should not depend on strength, and that compassion, when it is sincere, leaves a mark far deeper than punishment ever could. As I walk into my courtroom each morning now, I carry that lesson with me, in my pace, in my tone, in my willingness to pause. Because sometimes the most just thing you can do is slow down and see the person standing in front of you. I'm Frank Caprio. I've spent more than 4 decades on this bench because I believe something simple. Justice should steady people, not exhaust them. It should affirm dignity, not strip it away. And when someone shows up weak and tired, still trying to do the right thing, the least the law can do is meet them with compassion. Thank you for listening to this story.